We will now begin our webinar.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Mark Schneiderman with SIIA. Welcome to our webinar today, the Federal Learning Registry's Impact on the Education Industry. Before we get started, let me make a couple of brief announcements. First off, the webcast session is being recorded, and the audio file and other slides will be available and archived for our members on the Ed Division website of SIIA. We encourage you to submit questions or comments, especially questions, and use the chat function. We will not have audio phone questioning. We'll have simply through the chat. We'll monitor those and make sure we get those to our presenters. And let me just go over a couple quick announcements. We have some upcoming events. For those not as familiar with SIIA and our educational activities, there's a newscast on March 30th. This is an opportunity for you to understand about the various initiatives, working groups, and committees, and other activities that are taking place within SI's Education Division. So go ahead if you feel free to sign up for that. We have on April 6th a webinar, Understanding the Race to the Top Assessment PARC initiative. That's the Achieve and Florida Department of Education Assessment Consortia, one of the two Race to the Top Assessment Consortias. We'll be joined by Laura McGifford-Slover, the head of that project, to share the goals and implications of that initiative. And I think it would especially be of interest to those on this call as well. A lot of overlap on some of the technical and issues. On April 11th through 13th in Washington, D.C. is the SIIA EdTech Government Forum. This is our annual spring conference to help SI members understand the public policies and funding stream from the federal and state level that impact education and impact your customers and your business. Among the speakers will be colleagues of our speaker today from the U.S. Department of Education, including Jim Shelton and Joanne Weiss and others. There's a full agenda and list of speakers available. Encourage you to look at that and register. Our EdTech Industry Summit in San Francisco, May 22nd to 24th. That's the premier SII education event of the year. This year's theme is Growing Business in Challenging Markets, with the three tracks, post-secondary, personalized learning, and a trends track. And then finally, and this is something Sue can, I think, comment on more at the end, but this webinar is being sponsored by our Technical and Development Committee, chaired by Michael J. and Steve Nordmark, and including Sue Adelman as a participant. And we encourage any of you with interest in technical and product development issues to join that committee. Contact us for more information. And all the events are listed in the SIIA events calendar at SIIA.net. So let me now turn to our moderator. Sue Adelman is Director for Emerging Technology Strategies for Follett Software Company, a division of Follett Corporation. Follett has been supplying innovative educational tools and services for over 135 years, with a current global business footprint in 110 countries. In her current role at Follett, Susan is focused on next-generation learning platforms, content and data interoperability, growth measurement, and mobile learning. So now you know why she was stepped up to moderate this call. She has held a variety of engineering and market leadership roles in the software industry for the last 25 years, and is a member of the SI Technical and Development as well as Personalized Learning working groups. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sue to learn about this topic. I know, just on a personal note, I was at the U.S. Department of Education's National Rural Educational Technology Summit in July in Washington, D.C., when the Learning Registry was announced by Secretary of Education Duncan, along with the Smithsonian Secretary and the Federal Communications Commission Chair Julius Janikowski. And the initiative certainly should be interesting to see what impact it will have as the sector and the industry continue to work through issues around content portability and interoperability and really managing all the resources and assets out there. So with that, look forward to hearing from our speakers, and I'll turn it over to Sue to introduce Steve and take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this next hour and giving us your hour. I think it'll be, as Mark said, a really interesting look at the Federal Learning Registry and its impact on education in our EdTech world. I was going to start with a plug, again, for our software SIIA working group, but you did a great job of that, Mark, so I'll spare everybody from that. I will say, though, we mentioned our Tech Dev Committee and leadership. We also have a third co-chair, Robert Iskander, on that group. And at the end, we'll circle back and talk a little bit more and just remind people that that's a great place to participate. The format of our discussion today will be about a 20-minute presentation led by Steve Midgley. And then we'll start with some directed questions that our working groups have come up with over the past months as we've learned about the registry and its potential. And then we'll open this up to some questions at the end from the audience. So if you have questions during the presentation part, in the first part of this discussion, do send them along through the chat, and I'll store them up, and we'll try to cover as many of them as we can at the end. I have to say I have the great pleasure of introducing Steve Midgley as our presenter for this discussion today. Steve is the Deputy Director of Education Technology at the U.S. Department of Education. His principal areas of focus are data transparency, digital interoperability, and online learning. Prior to arriving at education, he was the Director of Education at the FCC, where he headed the team which developed the education chapter of the National Broadband Plan. Prior to government service, he was the principal of MixRun, a CTO consultancy for a number of for-profit and education sector organizations. You might know him. MixRun's clients included the California Department of Education's project called Brokers of Expertise, which uses online and real-world systems to share and build the expertise of educators. You may also have come across Steve as program manager for Stupski Foundation. He worked there for 6 years, designing and implementing grants for technology in K-12 education. This work involved intensive on-the-ground implementation work with both state and districts and state agencies around the country. In a previous life, Steve was also the founding vice president of engineering for LoopNet Incorporated, a commercial real estate listing firm. He designed and built LoopNet's technology and web systems from its inception. And LoopNet remains a successful business currently listed on the NASDAQ today. So we have a great opportunity to talk with Steve today. Welcome, Steve. Thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us today.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. Unfortunately, I have to be verbally moving through these slides as I'm on a backup computer at the moment, having some trouble with my primary workstation. So if we could move to the next slide. So these are just how you find us. If you're looking for the Learning Registry, we can go to the next slide. Learning Registry is essentially a multi-agency, multi-organization partnership, and we'll get into some of those details toward the end. So I'll first enter into the problem domain. Next slide. So I think a lot of what I'm going to cover, there we go. What I'm going to cover it's something that many of you have tremendous expertise in many ways, far more expertise than I do. So I'm going to make some assertions, and you may disagree or agree with various of them, but hopefully through the conversation we'll arrive at some interesting opportunities, both commercially and governmentally and so forth. So the first assertion is that we live in a fragmented world with abundance of learning resources, that the problem is not too few solutions. The problem is that we have a lot of great solutions, and that as we're moving into a digital world, the market channel by which solutions are being deployed in education as well as other industries is getting fragmented and harder to handle, harder to manage, and harder to control with traditional business models. So move to the next slide. And you can just see here there's just a lot of screenshots here of different products. Go to the next slide. So we suspect that for any given learning activity already today, the relevant digital learning resources already exist. So plenty of resources. Next slide. We also suspect that for any given question about resources, many users already know where it is and how to use it. And this is, I think, a really important distinction, which is to say not all the information, and a lot of you will know this implicitly, but not all the information that people need to know about your product is contained within your organization. You know, as many of you know, third-party references and connections between people who already know, hey, I'm using this and it's working great, is some of the best ways to drive traffic and drive sales, drive products. And if you look at organizations like Twitter, the way that they're deploying blog reference recommendations has actually created a whole new business for people who are essentially selling ads on their content for blogs. That's only one model, but Twitter is driving to a large extent in a way that, just to use a few more technical jargon, Adelman RSS and the RSS reader community really wasn't, in my opinion. All right, next slide. So what we want to do in the Learning Registry project is find and deliver good stuff to the right places. But good stuff is relative, meaning everyone has expertise and that opinions matter in this case. So the assertion that we're making is there is no such thing as a good learning resource, even when you get very specific about the topic. There are context elements about who is the learner, who is the teacher, what is the problem being solved, what are the misconceptions that they're currently suffering under, what are the skills that they have, the interests that they have, right? There's a number of variables that don't just reflect on the product. So traditional metadata descriptions of this product or this learning asset is categorized in these ways we think is insufficient because there's information about context about who does it help, when does it help, what circumstance does it help that are related to the learner and not the product. So that's an assertion I'd love to get into with you during the Q&A period. Okay, next slide. Ultimately, we want to know which learning resources have a positive effect in learning and share that. So we want to drive more feedback. We think the problem is a lack of feedback in the system today. Next slide. We want to provide users with what they need and want by sharing what other users know and do. So this is understanding the incentives for why people share and when they share. Next slide. And we think that the current approaches toward this type of model aren't working. Essentially, we have our Atom RSS type feeds. You can go to the next slide. So one of the solutions that you may hear from the federal government and other institutions, governmental and nonprofits, when they arrive at the sort of place that I just described, they say, let's build a portal, and then we'll get all the users to come to the portal, and then we'll deliver all the solutions, create a community, and it'll be dialogue, and it'll be great. Except that it doesn't work by and large. Largely building another, there are plenty of portals, many of you run them, and the ones that have traffic and are generating value are doing good work. There's nothing wrong with portals, but the notion that when you are faced with this problem, the answer is to build another portal is, I think, incorrect. That's not understanding the problem correctly. So we'll move to the next slide. This is just another way of saying what I just said, which is there are lots of answers already out there all over the place. And I think that more what we're facing is what email faced in the 80s when there were a bunch of custom email products out there all vertically stacked up on each other but not interoperable. So you couldn't get the email between these corporations in a way that was effective. At the time, the universities were transiting over SMTP just fine, but the corporation, the vertical market integrators that were providing email solutions couldn't enable that capability. And to some extent, what we're proposing is an SMTP-like exchange of learning resource information to open up exchange between organizations that currently don't have a mechanism to do this. All right, next slide. So this is another way of saying what I just said. Another thing that I call this is social networking for metadata. So we have social networking, but what does social networking for the machines and the metadata behind the scenes look like? It's not point-to-point communication like email, something a little different. So we'll dig into this. Okay, next slide. And we think there's a lot of information out there. So I mentioned metadata in the learning resource, but there's also things we call paradata and context and analytical data about how it's being used, where it's being used, how it's considered by institutions, 4 to 5 stars, by an elementary school teacher specializing in English language learning, or those type of questions of how do people regard it, how are they using it, how are they interacting with it, how are they combining it with other things. All of those types of information are things that we don't have access to today, and I think that it's possible that we could get access to those things and drive quite a lot more interesting relevancy, recommendation, and assembly than we have today. Next slide. All right, so I'll go into now what it is. I've described the problem domain, which is great, and a lot of you already have a lot of the problem domain well in hand in terms of understanding the market. But now I'll describe what we think is a potential part of the solution. And I want to be clear, we're very clear that this is not an answer or a solution or a platform at all, that this is simply a product that and a technique for sharing that we think can enable a bunch of organizations, nonprofit, for-profit, and governmental, to create new sources of value, new lines of business in the education space. All right, next slide. There's a community project, as I mentioned, lots of different members, and I'll show you a slide which lists a subset of the members a little bit later. Next slide. So, but first, just to talk about the sort of theoretical application of what we're up to. On the left-hand side, you see describe, discover, and recommend. So the description problem we have, to a large extent, Dublin Core and whether it's QTI for assessment or a common cartridge or SCORM or whatever it is, but ways of describing things. And we're moving up into the discovery realm, but we have some unsatisfactory outcomes there, I think, to date. Part of it is the fulfillment problem, which is you can't sell to individual teachers in the way that we sell to individual consumers, and so the market channel is not as fluid, so you end up spending a lot of time selling in bulk to large institutions, which can be expensive, time-consuming, and frustrating. And so I want to recognize that that part of the problem exists, and this may assist to some extent, but it doesn't resolve that issue. And then there's recommendation, which is a higher order thing. Moving over to the right-hand stack, what we see is that there are resources out there that get combined into services that are applied in some way in an application that gives some business process or educational process, as it were. And there's a community that sits around that and uses it. One of the things we're proposing is that metadata, if you look at the bottom of this triangle, starts out with not very much information. But if we start capturing service-level data, application-level data, and community-level data, metadata and paradata, we think we can undertake something called knowledge amplification, which would drive better information back into the system. Amazon, of course, does this internally quite impressively, as does Netflix and other institutions, where they're taking activity data and they're driving it back into the service layer and the application layer to give better service to the next customer. And that is a virtuous cycle, so to speak, to solve some of the problems that I think that we're experiencing in the market today. So next slide. Okay, so this is a very concrete, hopefully, description of how the Learning Registry actually works. Now, not technically, and I can get into that in the next couple slides, but this, to me, is the important concept of it's a stylized viewpoint, but it covers the main issues. So in the center, you see this, what we call a common metadata timeline, and that is the Learning Registry. It's a distributed framework, so there's no one plug to pull from the wall. There's no one domain name that could get canceled or sold. It doesn't work like that. It's similar to email in the sense that institutions who wish to participate can run or use infrastructure called email servers to communicate with each other. If one institution chooses not to participate, then no one can talk to them and they can't talk to the others, but it doesn't disrupt or interfere with the rest of the community. So that's a crucial concept here. Is this timeline is not a centralized timeline as with Facebook and Twitter. It's a decentralized timeline, more like a content distribution network. All right, so I'll describe the flow here, which I think is fairly important to understand what we're attempting. So NASA may have a new resource. I use NASA because, I have some influence over them in terms of what they publish, but this could be any organization. And they say, we have this cool new video on teaching fluid dynamics, and they put that into the timeline. National Science Digital Library, which maybe subscribes to NASA, right, in the same model that you subscribe to publishers in Twitter, you could similarly subscribe to publishers in the timeline. Says, okay, I got that, thanks. So they pull that metadata, and they present it to their user just as is, that's done today. There's nothing new happening there. But then NSDL, after having interacted with that resource for a while, publishes back onto the timeline, hey, 33 physics teachers are actually using this unit in their classroom, in lessons. and whatever level of detail they publish, they ship that back to the timeline. Now, PBS, who may not even be aware that NASA shares these resources, but does subscribe to NSDL, hears the conversation, hey, what unit? Oh, you're talking about a NASA unit. Well, that's great. We have physics teachers too. We trust what NSDL says and their users say about these resources, so we're going to provision that to our users as well. Now, the physics teacher then might have actually acquired the NASA resource off of PBS's site, but in fact it was NSDL teachers that told that physics teacher that they ought to be using it. And I think that that's a substantial observation that there's potentially some discussion with us. What's also important to recognize is that as that conversation happens, as it happens today, all of these things occur, but they occur in private party transactions that no one else can see. So they might, it's sort of like Adelman RSS, where I have a news reader and I might subscribe to 10 news sites, but no one knows what I'm consuming, although Google is to some extent changing that by centralizing it. But of course that creates the problem of one central apparatus. What we see in the timeline then is as these exchanges are occurring, we're collecting them all so that then it's not just NSDL and their 33 physics teachers. It might be any set of physics teachers or any other set of teachers who are making assertions about that resource. And it might turn out that in one case, a chemistry professor finds this is a suitable resource for teaching certain aspects of chemistry in an intro chemistry course in college. If they make that assertion and people trust that assertion at whatever degree we determine trust and identity work, then it might be that chemistry gets classified as something that can be used with this resource, and other people who are interested in chemistry begin to see this resource. And NASA and NSDL and PBS may never have reclassified or recategorized the primary first-class metadata to include chemistry, yet we're allowing the community to drive knowledge and relevancy about how these resources should be used, when they should be used. Now, it's important to note that all of this gets surfaced through third-party brokers, whether they be PBS, Capstone Digital, Agilix, commercial, nonprofit, for-profit, governmental, doesn't matter. These examples are nonprofit and governmental, but it can be anybody. So it doesn't surface through the timeline. The timeline is surfaced through third-party applications in much the same way that not many people use Twitter.com. They use TweetDeck and other applications to surface the information in highly value-added ways. All right, next slide. Okay, so this is just another viewpoint of the same thing. Any sort of resources pushing up through a common set of APIs, which we call the Learning Registry. That's a typo there, apologies. Up into an aggregator publisher, into a cloud of members who are utilizing those and providing services to educators. So this is exactly what I just said. But crucially, the Learning Registry network is only a technique for sharing. It isn't a technique for surfacing search or for making recommendations or for driving a taxonomy to a user in an interaction or anything like that. It's only a method for acquiring information about things and then provisioning them as makes sense to the particular organization and the particular user base. All right, so moving to the next slide. Okay, this is just another viewpoint, slightly more technical, about the producers who push things into the Learning Registry, this network of brokers, which we see as a set of services. A lot of it would include the registry, but then there'll be additional value-add capabilities, indexing and aggregation, recommendation algorithms, and these sorts of things that would come out of that. And then that gets pulled out both in the Learning Registry API and in third-party APIs that may be making leverage of Learning Registry data into a consumer network. And of course, crucially, the thing that I think that we are significantly missing today is feedback back from that consumer network into the producers, and what we think via the Learning Registry is an efficient way of accomplishing that. All right, next slide. Okay, next slide. So this is just my approach. I'm trying to do as little as possible, as quickly as possible. There's a thing I call bureaucratic heat death in DC, where if things take too long to plan, then they just die. They don't actually ever happen. So we're just trying to put some stuff out there as quickly as possible, get folks' input, get their engagement, and see if it works. And if it doesn't work, great, move on to the next thing. If it does work, let's build the pieces that make sense for the community that's actually using it. Next slide. And our design principles, because we think of this as infrastructure, we don't think proprietary is the right way. We have no bias against proprietary use of this in the same way that email has no bias against proprietary vendors, such as Google provisioning high-value capabilities on top of that email network. But this system ought to be open because we want it to be leveraged in all possible directions. And just some other lines about how we're approaching this, leveraging and mashing up. We're integrating technologies. We're not developing technologies. We're trying to focus on users rather than process. And we're generally not driving on requirements in a formal sense. We're building stuff that looks interesting that fits the needs of people near us. And we're trying to build this against test-driven. I don't know what the alternative to test-driven architecture actually is, which is why that's playing. Next slide. And we want to enable others. I made this point before. We don't want centralized infrastructure. I don't want this to be a government project. But I don't see anyone else interested in building this in a way that would allow everyone to participate with it. So that strikes me as something, if we can build what folks don't want to build so they can build what they do want to build, that strikes me as a good role for government. We don't want default winners, so we want to level the playing field so entrants, incumbents, and others can share with each other, and the best inventor wins, most innovative product wins. That strikes me as a good thing for the education sector. And we think that anyone can provide information here. So we're not creating a network of expertise. We're creating a network of reputation so that expertise is an opinion, and it will be validated by various organizations as they choose to trust and believe their local communities. And those communities, one man's opinion may be another man's fact, so to speak. And we think both those things should be legitimate within the network. And trust is not centralized, as I mentioned. That's another way of thinking about that. Okay, we'll move to the next slide. And here's our rough timeline. So we've released a set of specifications and test cases. We will have a hackable demo out on March 31. We're going to be heading over to Manchester, UK for a hack fest that university is hosting, and we'll try to engage some programmers there to see, does this meet the needs of the community in some interesting way. I should mention that all of this is open right now. The code base is wide open. The listserv is wide open. Our project-based phone calls, which some of you may actually listen in on, are open every week. April 30, we want some import-export tools, basic network actually running. We want some initial partner sharing live data. It's a little bit aggressive, but I think we can get there. And then adding more partners and more infrastructure. And September 30 is when we want to have something where we say, hey, look, this thing actually works. So it may not have all the features, the bells and whistles. It may not be polished, but it actually is functional, and you can rely on it. And that's our development timeline. And then we'll be investing next year. Our years are in September. Next year, another set of funds to try to move this out into integration questions. So how do we use this rather than how do we build this? And hopefully we can be engaging, building tools and utilities that would make it much easier for institutions, commercial and otherwise, to leverage this technology. All right, next slide. And you may have all seen this slide, but we're talking about more evenly distributing the future in my perspective. Next slide. And then we have some future challenges. I'm going to skip over these in the interest of time. Next slide. And this is just a list of partners that I mentioned. It's a subset, but it's a number of organizations who've been working with us. For-profit, nonprofit, semi-governmental, governmental, et cetera. All righty, so I think we can stop here and move on to questions, and I'll look forward to interacting. Thank you for your time on this.
Steve, that was a great overview of the who, what, when, where, how, and why. I think it opened up a lot of thought, and a number of questions have come in already. So I'm going to kind of jump around with some of the questions. The first one is on the subject of going back to the first question. One moment, please.
Sure.
Having to do with really what motivates the participants in this to actually return back their expertise and return back information to the system. What motivates them to participate? And that's probably expensive and costly to do.
Well, it could be. So I've been talking with a number of institutions about this question. let's just take LMSs as an easy one. If you're a teacher and you're dragging resources into your LMS to assign them as homework, there are sort of shoddily or hastily run LMSs, and there are highly structured, well-run LMSs. Let's take the latter case because it's an easier story. When you drag that resource to teach it, all of a sudden the LMS knows a ton about what you think about that resource. One, it ought to be taught. Two, the kind of students that you have are the kind of students you think are appropriate for it. Three, what subject area, what pedagogy might be associated with it, what particular standards area are associated with it, what time of the year, right? What kind of teacher are you, course number, right? There's a number of pieces of information it may have just by the act of dragging that resource, doing your job. And if your LMS popped up a screen at some point that said, hey, would you be willing to share anonymous usage data in order to improve your searches? And you click yes, then that system could potentially be emitting this sort of usage data back out to the network with absolutely no investment on the user side. They just do their job, and we watch them do their job, and we learn about these resources in ways that we couldn't before. And the principle of the Learning Registry is simply, we could do all that today, except we have nowhere to put that. So we might collect it in private, and that's okay. I have no objection to that. But I'm thinking a lot of institutions want to share this in public. They're perfectly happy for everyone to have this data. So why not give them a place to put it? And that's all the Learning Registry is about, essentially, is an assertion network where we can drive arbitrary assertions like this input from teachers and LMSs.
So what motivates, to your example that you just gave us with the learning management system being the collection point for that information, which understandably enriches knowledge across the board. If that learning management system is a third-party provider, what's their financial motivation to do that? An intermediary or a broker that does not necessarily get direct benefit, how do we get them to participate?
So they may or they may not. So we could go to Amazon and say, hey, why don't you open up all of your usage data and share it with the world? And you have a very short, unpleasant conversation about that with them, right? Then no, we make money on that. Why would we ever share that with anyone else? That's fine. There's absolutely nothing wrong with building proprietary networks. And in fact, we believe that the Learning Registry technology, as we're developing it, would permit institutions who wish to collect proprietary data behind closed doors to stand up Learning Registry networks that are not connected to the public one and use our technology to do that. So that's fine. I'll tell you, though, as I've talked to institutions, and the group here, we're welcome to voice in the negative, but everyone I talk to, for-profit, nonprofit, governmental, says at some level of granularity, I'm not going to share necessarily individual teacher grain, but I might share aggregated data of some variety. But I haven't run into anyone who says we simply will not share any data that we collect or could collect with this public network. So I agree that there are some questionable motivations here, but a lot of institutions are willing to share. If everyone chooses not to share, that's okay. But if there are a sufficient number of institutions who are sharing, I think we can have a flood of public data that potentially creates a virtuous cycle where there's less incentive not to share because there's already so much data out there. Now, I want to speak to a specific example, talking with Capstone Digital, who's on our technical working group, who has said, we absolutely need to share our resources into this network and get our partners to share what they're doing with these resources, because if they don't, we're losing market channel because people won't be discovering our resources, they'll be discovering something else. So this is simply an advertising network but a very specific and tangible sort of data-driven advertising network. Okay, that's my answer.
So Mark, we're getting a number of questions kind of along the same theme, which is, sharing ratings and usage. Some of those things can be very specific and others are very opinion-oriented. How do we ensure that the data that's collected is, that learning was delivered in a certain pedagogically correct way, and that as you measure things, you're actually measuring the same things? How is measurement integrity?
So this is not an assessment network in the sense of collecting rigorous psychometric data. So this is early days, right? So this is a research project. We're trying to figure out some of those questions. But we think there's some very good data or very good information and knowledge that can be extracted from data that are not rigorous aligned and proven in the way that you're describing. Crucially, trust is an aspect. So identity, we need to know who is saying what so that people can say, well, that is an untrustworthy provider. They are shipping data, and I don't believe their data for whatever reason, so I don't want to listen to them. And you should be able to exclude data providers from your feed. So just the way in Twitter, you don't have to listen to the entire timeline, which would be impossible. You can have lists, which include certain folks for certain categories. You can have hashtag searches, which include certain categoricals. And you can have your primary user list where you subscribe and listen. Now, what you listen to is different than in Learning Registry, but it's essentially an open network that permits a closed network of trusted interrelations. So it may be that 4 or 5 companies say, hey, we're just going to listen to each other's data. We're not going to listen to everyone else's, and that's okay. But other institutions may have a broader view or a different view. Hopefully that's getting close to your helping an answer.
Good. Jumping back to the slide about 21 or 22, when we looked at the diagram of how some of the parts and pieces are glued together, you mentioned the notion of a timeline. And can you explain that a little bit? I'm not sure, a repository timeline. Can you give me a little bit more information on why the word timeline there?
So this is not a repository in that sense. We're using a document-oriented database, what some people call a schema-free database, as our approach. So it doesn't mandate a particular schema or structure that you submit. And we're basically asserting you can filter it in many different ways, but we think a primary filter will be around date. So newer stuff is more interesting than older stuff on the timeline. And so, so basically there's a sort of rectangular shape to this vertically, like a timeline, like on Twitter, where things are popping up off the list in real time, and you can pull them down at that same speed. That seems like a perfectly reasonable way of collating information, meaning information that's 4 years old is less interesting in some cases to information that's recent. However, what's important is that you can go back and replay the timeline from any particular point in time. Now, we don't particularly have all the answers for when this turns into petabytes of data and how do we manage the caching and storing and back searching of vast catalogs. I think the technology will sort itself out along those lines, but that's what we're talking about, a timeline, which is people post things and each post has a date. So for example, if someone says, here's metadata about this resource, and then they post later saying, here's metadata about this resource, same resource. You could listen to both, but you probably just want to listen to the most recent one because it probably supersedes the earlier assertion. So rather than saying you log in, you go back to the old record and update it, you just post the same data again in a newer, with the edits that you wanted to make, and the old one can just flow off the bottom of the timeline.
Okay, that makes sense. Getting to some of the use cases for how this will be used, I think a lot of people on the call are familiar with New York School of One receiving an I3 grant. Can you take us through just kind of the use case? How would you anticipate Learning Registry might support School of One's work?
Sure.
As an example.
So, yeah, I think that's a great example, and that's exactly the kind of stuff that we want to support. So School of One has a predictive algorithm that they're developing, and it's in early days, but they're trying to basically take a bunch of different pieces of information, what we know about the student, what we know about the teacher skills, what we know about the content that's coming up, and say, you need to learn X next, right? I don't know if a lot of you have seen the Flipbook application on iPad, which is quite an interesting tool that you basically can integrate a lot of data streams, Twitter, Facebook, email, all these different sites that you might be interested in, and it creates a magazine that's your magazine. And as you flip through it, it's just different pages are your information. And when you flip to the next page, it won't be any page that anyone else is getting. It's the page that's relevant for you based on all of these different references and recommendations coming in. So right now, School of One is relying on its own internal data sets, what it knows about its kids to premise what it thinks what that child should learn next. And we think that if they could leverage a much broader data set of what lots of children are learning and where they're being effective, where certain tools are most relevant, they could build a much more powerful algorithm. And I actually think that there could be commercial providers, and I very much hope, in fact, in many public presentations, and I'll say it again here, I do not believe this project will be successful unless there are people making money creating value-add APIs on top of this product. So if this network doesn't have people building recommendation engines, building reference and referral solutions on top of it, then I think it will just wither and die. I don't think it will have the value that it needs to create a motivated community to keep it alive.
So it sounds like that's an opportunity for folks on the call, commercial solution providers, content providers, to step into that land of making sense of all of the resources that are available and the data about them.
And what I would say is whether or not Learning Registry exists, whether it's successful, that's the business that I see down the road. Is there's a lot of great content out there, but how do you connect it up in a way that makes sense for a learning sequence, right? So these learning trajectories, and learning trajectories, not just there is one learning trajectory for algebra, but there is a learning trajectory relevant for a particular student. And the more specific and customized you can get that, the more effective I think the learning application will be, and I think the more successful the corporation that develops that will be.
Do you anticipate that the algorithms, you mentioned resource recommendation algorithms a couple times, do you anticipate that there will be algorithms within, as a part of the registry data itself?
No. We're specifically and sort of willfully not building that stuff. That strikes me as, one, government's not very good at that stuff. I don't think we're smart enough. And two, I don't think that's an area that is settled enough, meaning there's so much innovation going on. I'll give you an example just in the commercial space where we think of relevancy recommendation as Google, right? And everyone's saying, oh, Google, well, I need to think of a better algorithm, right? And ask Queel how that worked out for them, right? The better Google algorithm may not be the road. Worked out great for Twitter, right? I get way better data about what blogs I personally should be reading off of Twitter than I ever did off of Google, and I think ever will get off of Google. And why? Because it's not Twitter's algorithm. It's the people behind Twitter, right? My people who I trust who are telling me what to do, but they're doing it through the vehicle of Twitter. And so when we're talking about algorithms, I just want to be clear that there's a broader definition of algorithm than just simply machine-based learning. There's sort of machine-facilitated interactions that we can also look at. And Learning Registry, I think, will be supportive of both of those, machine learning and machine-facilitated algorithms.
And you know, all over the Department of Education, personalized learning has been a pretty interesting topic from a symposium perspective over last August. And in some of the components that you're building here, I mean, do you believe this really supports personalized learning? Is that a goal, or how does that relate to, you know, the whole view of personalized learning?
So we talk about mass customization in personalized learning. So I think that this is an enabling characteristic of personalized learning. I think that this could be a big accelerant towards getting us to a place where we could have much more effective personalized learning solutions than we have today. But this in itself is not a personalized learning solution. This is just simply a communication framework that could be used for lots of different things. Some of our early use cases, you know, don't have much to do with personalized learning at all, just exchanging rating and review data among sites who wish to amplify their content with the content of others. But we think that there's a staircase of uses that this technique can be applied towards, and ultimately leading to highly sophisticated personalized learning solutions.
On the subject of interoperability, then, required to exchange lower-level learning objects, more granular types of learning objects, are the types of learning resources that are going to be data will be collected on fairly low-level atomic resources, or is it across the board? And what degree of interoperability? How will those resources potentially interrelate, or will they?
So this remains to be seen, I think, to some extent. But certainly we're not limiting it to atomic level resources. And in fact, what I find to be interesting is, as opposed to structured content where we say this resource in a piece of metadata is connected to these other three resources and passes through a learning progression in X, Y, Z way, that's fine. If people want to construct that, publish it, share it, that's great. But we also might see assertion networks that crop up where instead of that, what you see is a new piece of data. So there are 5 or 6 learning resources we might be talking about. And then you might see an event published out of an LMS that says, this teacher thinks these 3 resources are related to each other. And that's all you see, right? Just a little bit of a hint that these things actually could be taught together. Or another assertion might be, this resource is relevant for homework for this resource, or this resource is useful for direct instruction, or whatever the assertions might be, so that the job of aggregating that information into something that would look like a higher order learning resource might not get solved in the Learning Registry, but there might be a lot of hints that would enable people to do a lot better for a lot cheaper than they're doing today.
And with the large shift towards Common Core standards, are standards and alignment towards standards, or the organizational structure in any way represented in the learning objects?
That's a permitted attribute, of course, so we don't control what people send. So again, a teacher drags a resource into a particular lesson. That lesson is aligned to a particular Common Core standard. The LMS could emit, and this is just one way of collecting data. We think there are lots of others, but it's the one I introduced, so I'll keep using it. That LMS might emit, this resource is aligned to this standard according to a teacher at whatever level of anonymity that person is permitting. And so you might begin to construct a taxonomy of what resources are standards aligned, not by formal organizations, hiring banks of teachers and putting them in auditoriums in the summer and aligning resources manually, but simply by the weight of public opinion that says, well, geez, 3,300 teachers who teach elementary school think this is relevant for 5th grade science of 2.2.1. Okay, I'm a believer, and so what you'll start seeing is a scatter plot or a tendency towards standards alignment, not the sort of rigorous expert-driven alignment that we see in other applications or other solutions.
So that all, the collection of enrichment of additional metadata from a couple perspectives. It sounds like you're saying that commercial publishers and solution providers can provide value add for the content by providing maybe more robust metadata about their content, by participating in the exchange of metadata that exists out there already about other content and building on it. It sounds like anybody who participates has an opportunity to provide a little bit more richness either in their resources or in how they're using those resources.
And encouraging their partners or customers to also share so that the information is not just their own, but that it's just another kind of testimonial in a way, which is not a testimonial of, we'll fly you out here to meet with this other school district and tell them how great the thing is, which is fine, there's nothing wrong with that. But here we're just saying, look, we really want you to instrument your classroom so that you can share with the world the great stuff you're doing with our product, right? And it will be a raw data exchange at that level. It's not been conceivable up to now. I mean, our visibility into the classroom up to date has been extremely limited. And this isn't about breaking down the walls and peering behind the curtain. This is just simply about letting people share what they know already, right? Letting the experts who are in the classroom communicate with the experts who are out of the classroom. And that's something that I think we're really missing in the environment today, that there are many, many teachers who have a lot of expertise, skill, that simply don't have a voice in terms of sharing what they know in some semi-structured way like this.
So,
I went off topic, sorry. You were asking about commercial players, and yes, I think that a lot of commercial players may find value in publishing, and they may find a lot of value in consuming both.
I think the thing is always, about investment, and one of the things I guess I was wondering is, it's kind of taking the hard line on it, but there have been a lot of open source, federally sponsored repositories and initiatives. How do we, if we make investments in adopting and integrating this, which isn't probably a real simple thing to do from a solution provider's perspective easily, why should we do this and believe that it won't disappear in the reasonable future? You talked a little bit about its bulletproofed and decentralization. Is that something that you believe will sustain it so that we shouldn't be afraid of that? Can you?
Right. So this system will work like email, where if there are only 3 people who find it of value, but those 3 people don't want it to go away, it will not go away. Those people have it in their control to keep it running and sharing amongst those 3. If it happens there's 1,500 organizations that wish to communicate and share using it, then it will be a much bigger network with increased technical challenges. We think we're planning for the future in that way. But this is unlike traditional products that are closed to the open. This is free, and it replaces this thing that is costs money. So chasing private capital out of the market. That does happen sometimes accidentally, possibly on purpose. I don't know. I'm not going to speak to that. It's not my domain. But what I do know is that this project has no bias towards open that I can see. Now, there may be motivations that cause businesses to say, well, my business model is not compatible with this technique, but that I don't know is a good reason not to do something. The point of this to me is there's a lot of commercialization opportunities, and I certainly think about my own personal future. Would I be interested in commercializing solutions on top of this if it were successful? And I can imagine a world where I would do that or I would invest in doing that. So I personally think that there's tremendous marketability. There's opportunities for new innovation, opportunity for capturing new markets with this. So why would people choose to participate? If your products are really great and your users really love them and are using them highly effectively, I would think that you would want to get that information out as publicly as possible. That's on the published side. On the consumer side, if you think you can make sense of information that's coming from a broad array of data sources and collapse that into a set of services or business processes that you can represent to your customers in ways that give them more value, meaning new products or enhancements on old products, then I would think that you would be highly motivated to participate.
About the types of opportunity in using different metadata, I'm not sure if you said this and I didn't catch it, but when we talk about metadata that might be collected, subjective use ratings and assertions, is there objective data that's collected, such as text scores, time on task, other things that might be automatically added, or do you think that's still the domain of point solutions?
No. I think it's possible to collect that sort of stuff. It's a question of which communities are finding this useful to share. So if I can compel or make a compelling case, this isn't compelling in the government sense, but if I can make a compelling case that time on task is a really useful data element to collect, and I can go to the smartboard providers and say, well, look, can we keep some tasking information off of the whiteboard and ship it over to the registry if the teachers permit it? That could be fantastic, and that's highly rigorous, right? They taught this thing. It was up on the board for 8 minutes. This was up on the board for 30 seconds. Those sorts of pieces of data strike me as totally relevant. Now, I want to be clear that privacy is a critical concern, and there are things called the Mosaic Effect that you have to watch out for, which says even if you're publishing anonymous data, if you can collect enough pieces of information from enough locations, you can still piece together and de-anonymize that data. So we're going to have to, tread carefully in non-opinion-based data. Opinion-based data, people say, I want to share this opinion, then there's no problem with privacy. But where people want to share information but they don't want to be known who it is, I think that we will have to pay attention to that. But I think it's a really relevant area to collect.
I want to come back one more time to the notion of assertion-type information, community-driven, crowdsource, value-add collecting. I got in my mind the scatter plot diagram that shows emphasis on common contributions of data and value. I want to go back to when we get community-driven correlation, though, without actual context information about how a resource was used, in what context it was delivered, all of the things that go beyond just the resource itself and it being used. How do we ensure that that really is good alignment and not just raw data all compacted together?
Well, I think that's an excellent question, and that's, I think, a big reason why this isn't a solution that is going to surface to teachers. This is a solution that surfaces to providers. This is a B2B play. This is not a B2C play. We're not trying to disaggregate or disintermediate people who have customers from their customers or clients. We're trying, this is a good slide for that. We're trying to integrate, from my perspective, a set of solutions that enable providers to give better service to their customers. So that said, your question about connecting up resources to facts, some of that may surface in the registry. Some of that may be value add. I think that remains to be seen. I do think pedagogy is something that can be captured digitally to some extent. Not all teachers may record this, but in online learning environments, we may know exactly what pedagogy is being deployed alongside the resource and can ship that data back out in a machine-readable format into the registry. So
I think that's a great answer. That's a great way to wrap this up. I really appreciate all the time and all the good questions people have asked. I think we all walk away with knowing a lot more than we did when we started, so I really appreciate the deep view you've given us, Steve.
Sure, my pleasure. I look forward to staying in touch. And keep in mind the Learning Registry listservs are open, so if you want to join and participate, you're very welcome to provide your input there or to me directly. Thank you.
We'll turn it back to you, Mark.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Sue and Steve. And thanks to everyone for some great questions in the chat. Just a couple quick announcements. We'll be sending out shortly a post-webcast survey. Please take just a moment to respond to that so we have your feedback. Also, just one more reminder to encourage folks to join the Technical and Development Committee, where these kinds of issues are a topic of the monthly calls and of the ongoing work. And with that, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today, and this will conclude our webinar.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That does conclude our webinar for today. We thank you for your participation, and we ask that you please disconnect your lines. Thank you.